law is something that the whole world has in common, and that has evolved throughout history. It is also a very effective way to track discrimination in the way that certain races, religions, and genders were treated. This is one of the main things that we'll be focusing on in this video. Now, even though many countries have different laws, they still have them nonetheless. And in Europe and Asia, the history of law is everywhere, and many events led us to where we are today, and Canada is no different. But how did our legal system become what it is now? In order to find the answers, we're going to have to go way back to ancient Mesopotamia in 2047 BCE. Now, most people think Hammurabi was the first one to write a code of laws, but it was actually a king named Urnamu, who was the founder of the third dynasty in Ur. He wrote what is known as the Code of Urnamu, and it is believed to be the first completed law code in history. In his law code, punishments were based off of social class, meaning that if a higher classman were to commit a crime, he would most likely receive a fine instead of being hurled into fire. A few hundred years later came Hammurabi in his code of 282 rules carved in stone, his most famous rule being an eye for an eye, meaning that whatever crime was committed against you, you could do to your offender. Now, punishments rang true for both Urnamu and Hammurabi, but for women, they were actually able to hold political office and give political opinions. The rest of history tends to tell a different story for women. In 1240 BCE, what is now known as the Mosaic Law surfaced, when a man named Moses claimed that he had received 10 commandments from God. In Jewish faith, the 10 commandments is also known as the Old Testament. The Old Testament is made up of 5 books known as Torah, meaning law. It is often thought that God is a misogynist based on past scriptures and passages. But in the Mosaic Law, it clearly states that men and women were seen as equal. I wonder what happened. In 507 BCE, the Greeks were coming up with a new way to run their legal system. At the time, it was known as democratia law, but we now know it as democracy. Instead of a set of councils or judges, the Greeks had the boule, which was made up of 500 men, 50 from each of the 10 tribes in Greece at the time. Women were not allowed to be part of the boule, and they were not allowed to hold political office. But men were allowed to have gay lovers based on paintings, poems, etc. We're finally in the Common Era and out of the before. The year is 450 and we're in Rome. The Romans played a massive part in developing civil law, which is used throughout most of the world and especially in Canada. The Romans had Roman assemblies in order to create new laws. It was directly the legislative branch, and it was based on democracy. They came up with the 12 tables, which were sets of laws carved into 12 slabs of stone, which were presented before everyone so that punishment could be delivered equally between genders and races. In the year 550, cultures began to pick up on some of the ideals that were being shared throughout Europe and Asia, and eventually in the Byzantine Empire, they came up with a new set of laws they called the Justinian Code, which embodied civil law. This new code was heavily based on Roman law, equality, and thoughts and opinions from legal experts. Civil law in Quebec heavily follows the Justinian Code and Roman law. This new code increased rights for women and slaves. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, also known as William the Conqueror, conquered the British Isles and changed the course of history for most of Europe. He brought common law and a new kind of feudalism, which was based on case law and precedent, to England as well as most of Europe. With his new laws came new ways of defense, such as ordeal by combat, water, and fire. He also brought serfs, who could be owned by lords, but they were not the same as slaves, because serfs could not be sold and were promised protection, land, and justice. William's new laws had such a great impact on England as well as most of Europe that even after his death in 1087, his laws still stood, being tweaked and perfected for years afterward. Now this is one that I'm sure many of you have heard about by now, the Magna Carta. In 1215, King John came to power in England, and it was taxing the crap out of his people, leaving them poor and hungry. Eventually, the barons took control of London and wrote the Great Charter for him to sign. They took King John to Runnymede, Surrey, England, and forced him to sign the great document. The main takeaway from the charter was that no one was above the law and all were seen as equal underneath it, a law that still stands in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Around the 1600s, there was a time known as the Age of Absolutism, where great monarchs came to high power. Court and society became the attention of this power, and only highly intelligent men could take place at court. Monarchs and kings began to establish new laws for themselves, such as the right to wage war, taxation, legislation, etc. This new sense of power was influential to all of Europe and for many years to come. It made the lower class pay more respect to their rulers and take note of the consequences that would follow their actions. However, this would often lead to rioting and fear of losing any rights they had, but it would often be shut down quite quickly. In 1763, Britain was gaining all sorts of territory, including that of Canada, which was still slowly becoming a country, and at this time, they were in Quebec. They wanted to blend the French into English and only have English power, but since most of the province was made up of French people, this seemed highly unrealistic. Instead, they kept French civil law but introduced English criminal law. For years, the French fought to keep their native culture, language, and Roman Catholic religion, and in 1774, the Quebec Act was produced in order for Britain to gain allegiance from the Quebecers and have them swear allegiance to the King of Britain. The Quebec Act is known as one of the 5 intolerances made by Britain that led to the Revolution. In 1804, a very important monarch arose, which I'm sure many of you have heard of by now, Napoleon Bonaparte. This is a character who had many falls and rises throughout his lifetime, but overall left a huge impact on European law. Throughout his travels, he encountered many different countries, and even though he tried to pillage most of them, he still brought back many new ideals. Soon enough, laws were being codified around the entire continent, and all of Europe was following the same legal system. But this deeply deprived women and illegitimate children of their rights. We're finally in Canada and at its birthright. In 1867, PEI Charlottetown, the provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Province of Canada, which later came to be known as Quebec and Ontario, came together and formed the Dominion of Canada. The British North American Act, also known as the BNA, was signed, giving Canada independence from Britain and allowing it to be seen as its own country. However, the BNA dictated how Canada's law system, economy, and government should be run. This put the First Nations in the dark, as they had no say in what was going to happen to the land that they had originally settled. After the events of the Second World War, Canada, as well as the rest of the world, was at a mental standstill, and everyone seemed to realize that there really wasn't a document that outlined the rights and freedoms that everyone should equally be guaranteed. So in 1948, 3 years after the Second World War, the United Nations wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which 150 countries have adapted to thus far. Eventually, in 1960, Canada wrote its own declaration, which we now know as the Bill of Rights and Freedoms, signed by John Diefenbaker, the current Prime Minister at the time. This document was the first to outline the rights of Canadian citizens, but it was originally written in French. I understand that some of you might not find this next one very important to the history of Canadian law, but I'd like to bring the Health Care Act to light. After the events of World War II, Saskatchewan proposed the idea of a free healthcare system all over Canada, and eventually in 1950, British Columbia and Alberta both wanted to do the same. The federal government introduced the Medical Care Act in 1966 and in turn lowered their tax payments, but this allowed provincial governments to raise theirs. So tax was still equal, but the provinces could deliver proper health care based on those who need it and not those who can pay. Suck it, America! For years, thousands of years, women have been fighting for equal rights. They were underpaid and seen as property instead of people. And it took a Second World War for people to start to realize that women had some sort of an important role in society. When all the men went off to fight in the war, who was left to provide supplies and weapons, build airplanes and ships, and nurse the sick people back to health? The ladies, the women. However, change did not come so easily. After the events of World War II, women were just expected to go back home and continue on with how their lives had been before. This led to rioting throughout the 50s and 60s, as well as the demand of jobs. And eventually, in 1977, the Canadian Human Rights Act was enacted by the Parliament of Canada, ensuring that regardless of your sex, all rights were equal. Pierre Trudeau was Canada's Prime Minister from 1980 to 1984, and in that short amount of time, he did some amazing things for this country. In 1982, he patriated the BNA Act with the help of Margaret Thatcher, who was England's current Prime Minister at the time. He wanted Canadians to choose how they wanted their country to be run and to be able to have some sort of control over how their laws were created, including Aboriginal peoples. The BNA Act was renamed the Constitution Act, and the achievement between UK Parliament and Canadian Parliament is known as the Canada Act. As we come to a close, there is one more law endeavor that I would definitely like to bring to light, and it's considered one of the more recent events in Canadian law, and that is gay rights. Now, in 1969, the issue had sort of somewhat not really been dealt with, as same-sex interactions had been decriminalized, But in 1989, a man who worked in the Canadian Air Force, Joshua Birch, was exposed for being gay and was denied further raises and opportunities in the Air Force. This was brought up to the courts, and they realized that throughout the Canadian Human Rights Act, there was no mention or inclusion of sexuality. In 1996, Parliament was finally able to amend this and include all sexualities on the grounds of discrimination, which is ensured throughout all of Canada, no matter your race, religion, gender, or sexuality. So this is it, the end of the video, the end of my cluster of information. And I just want to say that after literally thousands of years of fighting for equal rights, Canada has finally managed it. And I know I talked about a lot of things in this video, but I didn't want to ignore the importance of other events, such as the Slavery Abolition Act in 1834 that ended slavery in all provinces of Canada, and the closing of residential schools in 1996. We are still trying to make up for all the harm that we caused. And I just want to say that here in Canada, now in Canada, no matter your race, religion, gender, sexuality, whatever, you are accepted here. And of course, there will always be people, wherever you go, that aren't okay with how you project yourself or tell your story, but there will also always be people here to support you. Canada is a country lawfully free from discrimination, and after everything it took to get here, I hope it only gets better. Thank you. Hi, Mr. Hall. He's my law teacher. This is all a project. Bye!
These so-called vacations will soon be my death. I'm so sick from the drink. I need home for a rest.
Doing that here!
Amazing! I even started the video. Yes.
A noose!
God!
Oh,
It's not recording yet, but I kind of want to hit the button.
Stop! What am I doing? You're climbing!
Oh!
Robbie and his 282 rules carved in stone. His most famous rule being an eye for an eye, meaning that whatever crimes. Wait, hold on a second. This is way further back. Bring the camera.
Oh!
What? You okay, no. Yeah, one. I don't know. Need a massage fight.
Squirrel!
Fucking, I can't the camera. I'm trying to fucking button. Roman assemblies.
Yeah, they had assemblies to negotiate which one of the kids was tossed off a roof or not.
Oh yeah.
Very funny. Watch this.
Heavily follow.
Yeah, hell follows it well.
It really follows the script immensely.
Yeah, up until the point where she does.
No.
Oh my lord.
I'll take some pictures. You guys also. Wait a
We still have laws, nonetheless.
And down from above to teach your children about the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Beat him across the head with a tape. Beat the child across the head.
No!
And he beat his children across the head with those 10 books. And they all... And the emoji changers, but really, do the goddamn thing. It's not that hard. I can always get the beard on if that makes it better.
No!
It goes to the Christmas pose!
Okay, let's watch it. Okay.
So,
Eventually, yeah, I'm not having that in the background. Penalized and there's mosquitoes everywhere. Courts and the Canadian Human. That is all I remember. They're like what? I don't know, wizards.
Holy
No, don't. Okay. In the year 50, throughout year 50, Pierre Trudeau was Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau.